Well, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Ellen Maese. I'm a researcher and methodologist at Gallup. Gallup's mission is really advice and analytics about everything that matters. And we certainly think that the COVID-19 pandemic counts and qualifies as part of that. So I'm happy to have this opportunity to share some of what we've been learning. You might have seen some of the articles and reports we've been putting out, some news features as well. But I want to share some findings that haven't been released as well and really look forward to discussing. Specifically, I'll be sharing some high-level insights that we've been finding about Americans' emotional journey through COVID-19. And again, this pandemic was really a mission moment for Gallup as part of our commitment to understanding the minds and the wills of the American people. We began tracking Americans' attitudes and opinions and feelings throughout the pandemic, starting at the beginning in mid-March. You can see kind of highlighted in red there on the incidence map. And that gray portion, you can see we've had really good coverage. That gray portion is actually the October data collection that has been in progress that we haven't quite analyzed yet, but we've really managed to cover this whole pandemic from the outset. Respondents were members of the Gallup panel, which is a probability-based nationally representative panel of US adults. We randomly select these samples using random digit dialing and address-based sampling. And as part of the analysis, we weight samples to correct for non-response bias and probability of selection. So it's really a good indication of where America stands. Through September, we've received more than 117,000 responses to this web survey, pretty evenly distributed across gender and age, with about 70% identifying as white or Caucasian. Finally, I will note that I do reference some other Gallup data during this presentation, just as a point of reference. Over the past 7 months, we've asked a lot, and I mean a lot of questions through the COVID-19 tracking survey. In fact, I'll be sharing some insights about remote work tomorrow as well, but that's really just scratching the surface of what we've uncovered during the pandemic. Right now, I do want to focus on emotions and life evaluation. So at Gallup, we measure life evaluation using the Cantrell Self-Striving Scale. And we've actually been doing this for decades. We do this worldwide. This is part of the World Happiness Report as well. The Cantrell Self-Striving Scale, that's what's shown here, asks respondents to imagine where they stand on a proverbial ladder, and with 10 being kind of the best life possible and 0 being the worst life possible. It asks 2 questions. The first is where you stand right now. The second is kind of their projection out 5 years. We categorize somebody as thriving if they rate their current life satisfaction as 7 or above and their 5-year projection as an 8 or above. That's what we consider thriving. People are literally usually a little bit more optimistic about their future. We've also been asking respondents to tell us about their daily emotions by asking, did you experience a lot of insert emotion here, a lot of the day yesterday? So specifically, we ask about happiness, enjoyment, stress, worry, anger, sadness, and loneliness throughout the pandemic, and a few others periodically as well. What we've seen has been really striking, to say the least. When the pandemic hit, we saw a drop in well-being, that's the percent of Americans categorized as thriving, to the lowest levels that we've seen since the recession of 2009. So these are actually, if we look back, this is some of the lowest levels that we've seen in the past few decades, with about only 46% of Americans reporting that they are thriving. And for reference, the other 2 points of categorization are suffering and struggling. So it's really not a good sign when people are shifting down from thriving into suffering or struggling. We did see a little bit of recovery over those summer months. You can see at the end of the scale. But again, in the fall, we're seeing a little bit more of a return down to, again, slipping below about 50% thriving. So I don't think it's very surprising to anyone who's lived through it that the pandemic has taken a toll on our well-being and our life evaluations. But it's certainly striking when you see it, and you see it compared to where we've been at pretty consistently. And it'll be really interesting to see where we go over these winter months as well. And now I also want to note that these are the general average numbers for the American population. Again, a really representative sample. But this is, some populations have really been hit a lot harder by this pandemic. So when we're taking a look at, for example, racial or ethnic minorities, we see that there's been a much greater drop in the well-being of these groups. And when we look at those who are most at risk for severe reactions to COVID-19, so people, for example, with chronic conditions like COPD or diabetes, things we know to be those high risk factors, we see even lower levels of well-being during this time and lower levels of life evaluation. So again, also not surprisingly, we've seen a lot of stress and worry during this pandemic. We see huge spikes in stress and worry with the onset of the pandemic. So you can see here, we're showing these levels through 2018, 2019, holding pretty constant. And then this big spike up when we see that March hit, right? This is the beginning, the outset of the pandemic. These are like a 15-point spike in stress, 20-point spike in worry. And again, we've been tracking Americans' emotions for some time at Gallup, and these are the spikes like we just don't see. So it's really striking when we see something like this. And what's notable too is that you can see this initial spike, but the levels of stress and worry really do remain pretty elevated throughout the pandemic, higher levels than we typically see in any other year. And so, what we know on a personal level, and obviously, as academics as well, is that stress like this and this kind of sustained elevation, it really takes a toll on people. And it takes a toll not just emotionally, but physiologically on their physical health. And that's something obviously we're really concerned about during a pandemic. So understanding the emotional ride of COVID-19 is not just stress and worry, although that's certainly a big part of it, but it's been a bumpy ride on a lot of levels. So looking at Americans' daily emotions and how they match up with key events across a series of emotions, we see there's been a lot of ups and downs in our emotions. It's definitely been a turbulent time, to say the least. So I want to call attention to just a few key events where we see some pretty striking emotional responses. In that initial shutdown, we already discussed that spike in stress and worry that we saw, but we also saw a pretty significant reaction of sadness during that time. And over the next couple months, we see that emotions start to kind of habituate. We kind of start to trend back towards a little bit more positive emotion, a little less negative emotion. And that pattern becomes really magnified when we started seeing states reopen kind of around that May timeframe, when things looked a little more optimistic and states started to open up a little bit more. And then, wouldn't you know it, with the events surrounding the killing of George Floyd by the police and the protests and riots that surrounded that, we saw a huge emotional response. And particularly, what's really notable, we see stress, worry, enjoyment decreases, but we see these huge spikes of sadness and of anger, which is really striking.
Ellen, I think we're at about time. I don't know if you.
Okay. Okay. Then I'll just roll through really quickly. We saw a greater response when we looked at African Americans' emotions during that time, much bigger stress, spikes of sadness and anger. And then a few key events, as we've seen, that we've been tracking, continuing to track, as mask mandates, looking at the social unrest, kind of as things, we're heading into the school year and big debates and controversies over whether the school year would open up or not open up. And debates and controversies over our teachers as well. So again, a big bumpy ride. And then I just wanted to highlight really quickly, kind of zooming in on that time when the states did start reopening. That was an interesting event because states reopened at different times and at different places. So looking at it just longitudinally kind of doesn't show the full picture. But we did look at it by aggregating against states when they were in that closed phase versus that open phase. And this is an example of Texas that really shows that overall pattern that we saw. Again, you can see that 2018 data to that light green bar, that huge drop when things closed down. And then as things open up, we did see increases in the amount of Americans who reported they were thriving, levels of enjoyment, drop-offs in worry, and in stress. So we'll open it up for discussion now, but these are some of the major trends that we've been seeing at Gallup, and we continue to track as well. Thank you.